Good morning. What a powerful time in worship. Um, Actually, during worship, I was reminded of a vision that I had long ago. I can't even remember when it was. Um, it was very brief, and I was standing on the esplanade, looking out over the ocean, and there was, I think it was either sunrise or sunset. There was a fiery orange glow throughout the sky, and there was this really thick storm cloud in the middle of the sky. And I began just in the moment feeling like it's pregnant with blessing and promises and vision for things I want to see in my life related to my own life calling. And yet the storm cloud looked menacing, was very dark. And isn't that often the way? It's like the darkness in the world, the way God works, within it is housed the secret to breakthrough and the fulfillment of our dreams, the transformation of that darkness into light. And as I stood there looking at the cloud, of all things, there was a turtle next to me. And I felt God telling me, patience. Turtle, a tortoise, they just keep slowly, calmly, steadily moving forward. And it's interesting that I was just reminded of that, and I think it's somehow related, or I'll make it related to what I want to talk about today. A couple of months ago, I think I gave a message on life calling, looking at the indigenous idea of the vision quest and how Jesus went through something similar in his life on earth. And I'm not talking about that today, but this is kind of a it's a very different message, but it's kind of related to that. As we think about our life calling, there's nothing probably more threatening to it than giving in to all the craziness in the world around us. Does anyone feel like the world has gone crazy? I do. And so I want to look at sort of a brief snapshot of what I see going on in the world, root it in history, and ultimately root it in how Jesus walked through the very same in his time. Because I think that can help us be true to our life callings without getting distracted and pulled into all the political winds of the day. So, and the band played on. Has anyone ever heard of that saying? What does it mean? Yeah. Actually, it's often referenced to Titanic. The Titanic was sinking, and there was a band, a string quartet, or I think it may have been 8 people, who continued playing as the ship was sinking to calm the passengers. And in a way, that can seem very heroic. It may have been. But the way the term often gets used is just keep acting like there's not a problem. Business as usual. Carry on. Despite what's going on, the ship is literally sinking. People are running back and forth like crazy. Let's continue with business as usual because we never learn from history. And I believe that's what's happening in the world today. History repeats itself. Um, and the band played on was actually also a famous book written in the 80s by Randy Schultz about the initiation of the AIDS epidemic. And it was specifically about during the 80s, as it started, the first few cases started breaking out and there was some initial panic. There was an extraordinarily slow response to it in terms of government policy, in terms of science, in terms of there was a lot of red tape, there were a lot of petty rivalries going on. Probably sounds familiar to COVID. And because of the stigma associated with homosexuality, which was one of the ways that it was initially spread, at least in North America, a lot of people didn't want to touch it, didn't want to do the research. And so in the midst of all of that, I mean, that was the band playing on. It was business as usual, red tape as usual, political discussions, head banging, and meanwhile lives were being lost. And this thing that could have taken a very different trajectory became one of the biggest pandemics in history. And it certainly ravaged this continent. So the question is, what is the band playing on to today? And what is the greatest crisis of our day? And in my own humble opinion, I believe the greatest crisis we face, because it's related to so many other crises, is societal fracture. A deepening fracture in society where people are being separated from one another. And there's no more cohesion. It feels like the social fabric is literally falling apart. And this is actually, it's related to, it's rooted in, and it also ends up not only being caused by, but perpetuating things like extreme wealth inequality and economic disparity, political polarization, far right, far left, not a whole lot in between anymore. And let me tell you, if you go far enough to the right or far enough to the left, they join. Same WhatsApp group. It's true. They both end up being authoritarian. High youth unemployment. Our country is ravaged by that. That is a characteristic of a fractured society. Othering, xenophobia. These are things that are very real in this country. Violence against foreigners, deep societal fractures, environmental threats and social vulnerability that's related to that, urban decay. I could go on, but generally it's a cultural disorientation. And it's almost like people in general don't know where to put their feet. The grounds are constantly shifting so fast. So I believe that this is inherent in so many problems that the world is facing. It might well be the greatest crisis of our time, a fracturing of society. And in the midst of that, what does the band playing on look like? Maybe more than any other thing I can think of, it's political oppression. Authoritarianism. And again, this isn't about right or left. This is about scapegoating, naming, blaming, and shaming. It's about bullying, intimidation, power grabbing. History repeats itself. This stuff has been going on since the beginning of time, and it is still raging today. It's almost like it follows a playbook. And so, what I want to do is look at, often when we think about the Gospels and the way what Jesus went through, we think about religious oppression. It was the Pharisees, it was the Sadducees, it was all these people in the church structures that actually wanted to eliminate him because he was threatening their favor, their positions. But much less is mentioned, or I think talked about, around the political oppression of Jesus' day. much less the way he navigated it. And that's actually what I was interested in looking at, because I really feel like there's a lot of parallels that would help inform what we are going through today. Maybe dressed up in different clothing, but it's the same idea. And how did Jesus navigate those times? So, the first, well, yeah, the first example of political oppression that was mentioned in relation to the life of Jesus was Herod the First, also called Herod the Great. He was the reigning king, and we know the story. Matthew 2 details it. I want to read it because there's so much that comes out of here. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and we've come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And gathering together the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For from them you will come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Herod secretly called for the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him.' When they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared." Sorry, I missed a part. The actual birth of Jesus. That's kind of important. "After hearing the king, they went their way, and behold, the star, which they had seen in the east, went on ahead of them until it came to stop over the place where the child was to be found. And they saw the star, and they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after they came into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after being warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. Now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him.' So Joseph got up, took the child with his mother while it was still night, and left for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod. This happened so that what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet would be fulfilled. 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" And then the ending of the chapter, "When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became enraged and sent men and killed all the boys who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity who were 2 years old or under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more." So the key manifestations of Herod's political oppression included, first of all, very interesting, projected self-righteousness, so that I may come and also worship him. Often the most ruthless authoritarians throughout history have disguised their agenda as righteous and worship of God. Then he erupts into rage when he finds out he's been disobeyed and tricked. And what comes out of that? Ruthless violence, genocide. Can you imagine killing of babies? What is Jesus' response? Well, he's a baby, so he's not making a conscious response, but it's very interesting that the first thing that happens to Jesus in his life through his dad who heard in a dream from God, he becomes a refugee. Jesus' response to severe oppression is to become a refugee. And who knows what they went through? We're not told what they went through in Egypt. I wonder if this somehow helped form the basis for Jesus finding solidarity with poor and oppressed people. He was a refugee himself. Do you know that currently, by the most recent statistics, we have nearly 120 million refugees in the world who have been displaced either internally or to other countries through violence, through political oppression. So this is raging all over the world. And refugees are probably the most stigmatized and the most vulnerable populations because they're away from anything familiar to them. And you can imagine amidst such stigma, maybe legalities are not really protecting them. Imagine what that does internally, even in their own minds. I want to play a snippet from a movie. If any of you have ever seen the movie The Swimmers, it is really powerful. It's based on a true story of two Syrian refugee sisters who were being trained by their dad for the Olympics, swimmers. And then Syria fell into collapse. There was bombing, violence took over the land, and they were forced to flee to save their own lives and to try to find a way that they could bring their own family over eventually. And so eventually they go through this really long trek together with other refugees, crossing the sea to get to Europe. And then it's about a long trek across Europe and they end up in Germany. And the rest of the movie, it's quite uplifting. One of them actually ends up sticking with swimming, finding a German coach who trains her, and she ends up going to the Olympics in Rio, in Brazil, when they were held there. But I want to show a snippet. It is a scene that has haunted me ever since I saw it. It's 1 minute long, but this is what happens when they wash up on the shores of southern Europe. They see a spinning circle. There we go. Turtle, yes. Maybe it's not going to play. I think, yeah, if it's not going to play, we can move on. Everyone stretch out your hands. Last effort in Jesus' name. No, it's okay. Um, so it was hard to see because of but those were life jackets. Refugees are not a political issue. They are a human issue. And every one of those life jackets was worn by someone who had a mom, who had an upbringing, who had a life, who had dreams and hopes, probably which came under severe duress to the point where they were willing to try to go on a really perilous journey to do something about it, fleeing from oppression. What ultimately happened to Herod the Great? He died after a long, agonizing, unidentified illness, which caused severe physical and mental torment. His death actually followed after years of extreme paranoia, in which he executed multiple family members, including one of his sons. And it's a tragedy, but he ultimately reaped what he had sown his whole life. The next person, another son who took his place, was Herod Antipas. This was the next leader who was in place during Jesus' life, and he's the one who was in place as Jesus grew up and actually went through his public ministry. And I won't read through all the scriptures, but Matthew 14 details, and we know the story, he had John the Baptist executed. Why? Because John the Baptist was pointing out that he had taken his brother's wife for his own. So he was pointing out this horrific act of immorality, challenging the king on it. He was imprisoned. He wasn't immediately put to death because Herod Antipas feared the people, because so many people saw John the Baptist as a prophet. So he kept him imprisoned. And then this really weird story that on his birthday, Herodias, who he was committing adultery with, her daughter performed a dance, and he was so pleased with it that he gave an oath before all of his dinner guests. And he basically said, "Anything you want, I will give it to you. You have pleased me so much." And, oh my word, her mother whispers in her ear, and she says, "Give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And that's what happens. His heart hits the ground because he realizes he's just given an oath and he's trying to save face. So he saves his own butt and he kills John the Baptist. When John the Baptist's followers report this to Jesus, Jesus is deeply grieved, and he goes off to an isolated place to be by himself and mourn and lament. But very interestingly, the people find him, and they're desperate for him, and it says he had compassion on them. It's almost like as an expression of his, in my case, I would probably be like, "Oh, please give me a few days. I can't do this right now." Jesus actually had compassion on the masses who came to him, and he healed them. And he worked with them. And eventually, as more and more gathered around, That's when the multiplication of the bread and fish happened. And it's really interesting. I mean, we know that story as well. There's a child who offers what little he has, and Jesus is so thankful for it, and he takes it, and he thanks God for his provision and begins breaking it up to give it out. And in some mystical way, everything multiplies, and thousands of people eat. And who knows how that happened? We're not actually told. It's easy to assume that out of nowhere, and that may have happened. It may have God may have multiplied it out of thin air. I find it hard to believe that no one else among the thousands and thousands had any food. And I wonder if at least part of what happened was people saw Jesus taking this child. This child was this extraordinarily generous act of giving what little he had. And Jesus so thankful for it, and that they were likewise inspired to give what they had to one another. It becomes the most giant act of communion in history. Would that be any less miraculous? Where people are actually inspired to share whatever they have with one another. Regardless, it was extraordinary what happened that day, and everyone ate and had their fill, and there was more left over. Then what happened? Same chapter. A lot happens in this chapter of Matthew 14. Jesus' disciples go onto the boat while he's going off by himself. And then they get in trouble, and there's storms tossing them about, and they're scared, and Jesus comes walking to them on water. And he says, "Don't be scared, take courage, it's me." And we know the story. Then Peter gets the courage enough to step in the water and walk toward him, has a baptismal experience as he starts growing fearful and sinks, and Jesus is right there to reach out and grab him. And he says, "Why did you have so little faith?" You know, it's extraordinary what has just happened right after his friend was executed in such a violent, in a frivolous manner. So there's this. His friend's been punished for speaking out against that. That was the form that Herod Antipas's oppression was taking. He was punishing and imprisoning anyone who would dare challenge him. He saved face through violence. He passed the same generational curse. Have you ever thought about Herodias' daughter after she was used as an instrument to perform such an act of violence? What was the rest of her life like? Surely that's a trauma she carried with her. I can't imagine. But Jesus' response to this, he first seeks time with his Father to just simply grieve and lament. His friend, the loss of his friend and brother and cousin who he'd grown up with. Maybe the injustice surrounding all of it. But even amidst his intense grief, he sees the oppressive problems. He sees beyond them toward vision and possibility. He has compassion and empathy for the oppressed and the suffering. He focuses and gives thanks for an act of kindness and generosity, like the child giving him what little food he had. He helps create an abundance from what seemed like a lack, and inspires generosity among everyone so that everyone could eat. He joins his brothers in their hour of panic on the water and inspires them to have courage. He helps calm their fears. All of this in the midst of his grief. So it's like in the midst of the worst of mankind, this grievous act of violence that is nonsensical, Jesus brings out the best from people. That's his act of lament. He takes the worst and he brings out the best. I just want to play another video clip, if it plays. A guy named Sean Ginwright, who I follow, wrote an incredible book called The Four Pivots. But it's a little 1-minute clip about the greatest tragedy of oppression. Yeah, that's it.
Oppression is not blocked opportunity. The greatest consequence of oppression is not marginalization. The greatest consequence of oppression is the destruction of our inability to see beyond it. We can't see beyond the current condition. That's what oppression does. And as a result of that, we stay locked into wanting lower levels of misery and calling that victory, right? And that's because we haven't yet operated the muscle to begin to see possibilities and things that are right before us. And it doesn't mean that we stop addressing problems, but it means that if we want justice, we have to do both, Angel. We have to solve problems, and we also have to create and lean into the power of dreaming in our imagination of what we really want.
Okay, so this is exactly what Jesus did. He saw beyond the oppression. He saw the greater vision. He didn't lose track of what God was calling him to in his life. This wasn't the end of his interaction with Herod Antipas. In Luke 13, he actually referred to Herod Antipas as that fox, a deceiver. When the Pharisees were coming to him saying, "You better run, because Herod is after you. He wants to kill you." And he called him that fox. Tell him that I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. So he saw through, and he didn't become a part. He wasn't sucked into the politics of what was happening. He continued with his life purpose, with his calling, with his own vision. And ultimately, in the hours before Jesus was crucified, we know the story. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, trying to get rid of the problem. And Herod was entertained. He had been waiting to see Jesus. He wanted him to perform signs and wonders and miracles right in front of him, and Jesus just stayed silent. He refused to participate. And then they treated him with contempt, and they mocked him, and they dressed him in a brightly shining robe and sent him back to Pilate. And so, again, in the midst, that was another form that the oppression took: mocking, shaming, laughing at, treating with brutality. And in the midst of that, Jesus refused to be a part of it. He saw how this was actually ultimately going to help fulfill his mission. What ended up happening to Herod Antipas? He eventually fell out of favor with Rome, and he was exiled to Gaul, which is modern-day France, where he eventually died. He was even accused of conspiracy by his own family, Agrippa I, and all of his lands and his wealth were confiscated, and his wife Herodias joined him in exile. Again, tragically, he reaped what he sowed. The final quick example I want to mention was Pontius Pilate. Now, he was a Roman. And again, as with Pilate, he clearly had a God complex. That's another facet of political oppression. He actually told Jesus, "Don't you want to answer to me? Your life is in my hands. I can save your life or I can have you put to death." And Jesus said, "Unless my Father above gave you power over me, you would have none." So Jesus reveals that he's living by a much higher power. Pilate, he tried to get rid of the problem. He didn't want to put Jesus to death, and he tried handing it over to Herod. Herod sent him back. And then what does he do? He washes his hands. He says, "His blood is on all of you who are yelling for Jesus to be crucified." Washing his hands of responsibility, that's another oppressive tactic. And he ultimately fears losing his position because he senses there might be a riot, and then I'm going to suffer. I'm going to lose my job. And so he rather than standing up for the right thing, he saves face and releases Jesus to be crucified. Spineless self-preservation. Jesus' response, he does not answer to any of this. He doesn't beg for his life. He doesn't issue threats. He doesn't play their game. He's not drawn into corrupted power trips and plays. He just points to the world he lives in, a much higher law, and he ultimately fulfills his mission by giving his life, which makes a statement that continues to this day. We are all here because of what he did, because he fulfilled his life purpose and he wasn't thwarted from it with the oppressive political winds of the day. So, what can we learn from all of this? How do we follow in Jesus' footsteps? Do we get drawn into all the craziness happening? Naming, blaming, and shaming. It's this person's fault. It's this person's fault. It's that country's fault. It's this group of people's fault. Shouting louder than our opponents to try to outnoise them. And it just creates more noise. Or do we retreat in fear and disillusionment and stick our heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening? Because what can we do? Do we limit our imagination, as Sean Genright was alluding to, and only work within the confines of what the world is offering us? The only solutions we can think of are those that make what is miserable a little bit less miserable. That is no victory. That is not vision. That is not life calling. That's playing in the enemy's territory. Or do we let our faithful actions speak louder than our words? The author of Hebrews speaks to this in Hebrews 11. Those heroes who died still clinging to their faith, not having received the fullness of what had been promised them, but they could see it from a distance, and they kept going. A dear friend of mine who's the CEO of the global organization I work with, Scott Olson, he recently wrote, "In uncertain moments, the goal is not to figure everything out. It is to stay rooted within what we already know, rooted in Christ, rooted in our calling, rooted in the work we have been given to do." Easter reminds us that some of the most important things God does unfold before they are fully understood. When we stay rooted, we are not pulled into the pressure to have immediate answers. We are not rushed into conclusions we're not ready to make. We're not shaped by the urgency to resolve what is still unfolding. Instead, we remain present. We see people clearly. We love people well. We continue the work in front of us with steadiness and care. This is not passive, it is quiet strength. I feel like even with Land of the Living, we're certainly not perfect, and I sometimes get lost in a lot of worry and fear and stress. But one thing we try to do with whatever few youth we have working with us, we try to be faithful with it and do everything we know how to do and rely on God ultimately to bring transformation in their lives, even if it's just a few people, with a vision that they can turn around and become changers of their entire communities. And sometimes it feels like we're taking 3 steps back rather for every 2 steps forward. But we have to keep going. That is one of the greatest forms of activism for change. It's not a big, loud thing. It's being faithful with what God has given you to do, put right in front of you. If any of you feels like, yeah, but the problem is so rooted, the world has gone crazy, what is my little faithful action going to do? Listen to the faithful advice of 2 wise Margarets. Margaret Mead, an anthropologist, said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Jesus and his disciples, case in point. And then a lady I follow named Margaret Wheatley. She actually details, first she talks about the phenomenon of the quantum leap, where an electron, sorry, I'm a science dork, an electron suddenly disappears from one orbit and reappears in another higher orbit. And physicists have not been able to measure how it happened, the transition or anything. It just disappears from one and appears in another. And she likens that to the fall of the Berlin Wall. It wasn't a critical mass of people, and they finally got enough people to join this movement, and then they overthrew the wall. No, it was a bunch of small, isolated incidents. People in their own little ways defying what the oppressive government was trying to force on them. And at the right time, whatever that means, it all came together, and suddenly, within a few days, the Berlin Wall fell. And the oppressive regime did not know, they didn't see it coming, because they could not understand this concept that God will weave together all of this stuff to bring momentous change. It's not up to us to get the whole world to follow us. Be faithful with what God has put right in front of you. So to land this plane, I want to play one more clip, and this is the final scene of the movie, and the band played on. And it's the reason I want to play it. I haven't been talking about the HIV epidemic, but in the midst of all of the stuff that was going on and the message was being lost, there were individual lives in this video very poignantly. It's about a father who was reunited with his son on his deathbed. And it was almost too late. Praise God, they got reunited and had a loving moment of connection. But in the midst of all the politics flying around about that epidemic, there were so many emotions pulling people and dividing people apart, and there were people who were dying, and they had faces and they had names. And Jesus saw this. He saw faces. He knew names. He didn't get swept up in the politics of the day. So let's give this a watch.